Hello, welcome to Atheist Talk, produced by Minnesota Atheists. Minnesota Atheists practices positive, friendly neighborhood atheism in order to provide a community for atheists, educate the public about atheism, and promote separation of state and church. We offer free literature and speakers about atheism to the public, as well as a free sample newsletter to anyone interested. Our contact information will appear during and at the end of this program. We hope that if you like what you see, you'll consider becoming a member of Minnesota Atheists. If you're interested in us, we're interested in you. My guest today is author, professor, and critical thinking activist, Dr. Dale McGowan. In addition to several degrees in the arts, Dr. McGowan holds a degree in physical anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley. It was in that program that Dr. McGowan gained a deep understanding and appreciation of evolution by natural selection. He also has a lifelong commitment to promoting a public understanding of this astonishing and powerful fact. He joins us today to discuss the so-called intelligent design theory being promoted by creationists in a show that we're calling Unintelligent Design. Dr. McGowan, welcome to our program.
Thanks very much, August. Glad to be here.
Okay. Well, let's jump right into it. Most people have only heard the phrase intelligent design in the past couple years. Is this a new idea?
Well, the phrase is new, but the idea is very old. The idea has been around for centuries. It has been called the teleological argument for the existence of God. It's one of the multi-syllable arguments. And what it boils down to, its formal articulation, one of the most formal articulations was by the theologian William Paley in the 18th century, who likened the universe to a machine. Specifically, I think he used the analogy of a watch. He said that the universe runs like a watch, and certainly if you found a watch lying in the road, you would understand there to be a watchmaker. And since the universe, he said, is analogous to that watch, then there must also be a maker of the universe. And that articulation was immediately challenged by people like David Hume, Scottish philosopher, who said, well, the question with any analogy is whether the analogy holds. And he said, I can think immediately of several other analogies that hold just as well. One of them is that the universe is like an organism. There are many features of the universe that are like an organism. And so we could say that the universe came into being by reproduction, that another universe actually gave birth to it. That's just as solid an analogy. But the fact is, in the absence of another solid explanation for the diversity of life that we see, the teleological argument was a good fallback. They didn't call it intelligent design then, but that's essentially what it was. But in the 1840s and 50s, Charles Darwin began to put together the theory of natural selection, evolution through natural selection, and he had every personal inclination toward the teleological argument. He studied to be a minister and said when he was putting together the theory of evolution that he felt like he was committing a murder, but that the evidence was drawing him in that direction, and that it ended up being a very powerful explanatory theory, finally published in 1859. The important thing to realize in balancing those two theories at that point, teleological and then evolution by natural selection, is that scientists didn't leap on board the evolutionary bandwagon right away. There's sort of this impression that scientists are somehow only predisposed to evolutionary theory and always have been. The fact is that there was a hailstorm of critique for 70 years, a couple of generations, several generations of scientists who did everything they possibly could to sink the ship, which is the way science behaves. You try to see if it's going to float.
Yeah, it's perfectly legitimate to question a scientific theory.
Absolutely, it actually has to be done when the theory's advanced. One of the strong challenges was actually a theological argument advanced by scientists at the time. It's one of the teleological arguments called irreducible complexity. The idea is that there are certain biological systems that are so complex they couldn't possibly have had lower intermediaries that had any benefit. For example, the human eye couldn't have had any evolutionary intermediates, is what this argument says, because what good is half an eye? And that was a pretty strong argument on the face of it until we began looking around nature and finding out that there are all sorts of intermediates of the full eye, everything from light receptor cells, photoreceptors that are able to tell whether it's light or dark, to cells that can sense motion, to simple eyes that can sense shape, and then some that can distinguish black and white images, and finally the fully developed eye as we see it now. They actually coexist in time right now, so it's not difficult in
There's
retrospect.
examples of all these stages right now.
Exactly, and somewhere in the animal kingdom at this moment are all of the theoretical intermediaries in practice, so it's not terribly difficult to see.
So there is a use for half an eye.
Absolutely.
It's not as good as our full eye.
No,
but
right.
It's useful.
But it's better than a quarter of the
Exactly.
functions of
It
an
has
eye and
some
so on.
survival advantage.
And the problem with the phrase half an eye is that you picture it evolving from left to right, or from bottom to top, or
right.
something like that. And so as soon as you frame the argument properly and look at the evidence, the irreducible complexity argument fell apart in one example after another. But it took a lot of time to do that, and the thing that it took was scientific argument arrayed against the theory of evolution to see if it could take that. Once it was seen, by the time we get into the 1920s and 30s, and there's a synthesis with genetics, by that time the scientific community had seen that evolution had withstood all of these arguments, including the teleological argument. Teleology was dead at that point. It was understood to not be a valid argument, but suddenly it's back. And it has a different name. Now, has there been new information? Has there been some sort of new discovery? No, there's nothing new. All there is a failure to read scientific history and to see that this has already been dealt with great critical scrutiny and with great honesty over the course of several generations.
Okay, so you talked about the scrutiny that evolution was given, and doubts were brought up, and evolution defended its position, or scientists defended it. Right. Is intelligent design a science?
Well, this is an interesting question. There is one difference from the simple teleological argument and the way ID, the shorthand for it, is working to frame itself now. They are working very hard to frame it in scientific terms. And the fact is, I applaud that. I think that's exactly what they need to be doing. And I think as much as possible, science should be encouraging that, should be saying, yes, if you want to frame it that way, then we can start talking.
Okay.
So it's actually
fair.
something, yeah, in a way, it's an admission by creationists that science is in fact the way to proceed. This is the way to frame the argument so that we can move forward. But what they don't seem to realize is that the arguments have already been framed in scientific terms 120 years ago. All they have to do is look at the literature that was written then and realize that this was actually done, and we could save ourselves a lot of time. But barring that, let them bring the arguments forward, and we can take a look at it. So the question of whether it's science or not boils down to two things. First of all, does it follow the scientific method as laid out and understood currently? And then did it open itself up to the scrutiny of the scientific community for confirmation? So there are four general steps that a theory must follow in order to be recognized typically as scientific theory. It has to be based on observable phenomena. It should be subject to repeatable testing. It should be falsifiable, meaning that at least theoretically it should be able to be disproven by something. And it should be tentative, meaning that it is always subject to revision on the basis of new evidence coming up. And this is a bare procedural minimum. If you follow those four steps, you might still not come up with the truth. You might still not come up with something that's accurate. The flat Earth hypothesis actually followed all four of those steps. But once it was scrutinized, it was falsified. It was seen through observation over time as we got better means of observation. It was seen that the falsifiable claims in that theory were in fact false.
Okay. You brought up an interesting point that the creationists or intelligent designers are having to frame their arguments in terms of science, which means that it's not enough to say God did it. So in other words, science is triumphing religion. That science is seen as the higher standard, higher than religion.
This is the thing I'd like to encourage. I really think that it's they're recognizing something valid here that we can work with, and that we can actually honor in its intention and sort of bring into the literature as much as possible, as much as it bears peer review. The problem is that to this point there has not been a single scientific paper bearing out any of the ideas of intelligent design because it has not passed the peer review process.
Now, one of the standards you mentioned a theory has to pass is a falsifiable claim. How does intelligent design do with that?
I see at least two falsifiable claims, which is a good thing. Falsifiable claims in ID. One of them is this idea of irreducible complexity, which is at the heart of the theory, that there are certain things in the world that are simply too complex and perfect to imagine having developed from less perfect, less complex intermediaries. If we can show repeatedly that the examples that are being brought forward as of irreducible complexity actually have intermediaries, we can find it either in the fossil record or in contemporary biology, then that would be a falsification, one example at a time. And that claim has been brilliantly falsified over and over again whenever these examples have been brought up. But there's another one, and this is the one that I think we can move to today, which is right there in the name. There is a premise in the name that the, quote, design that we see in living things is in fact intelligent, that it shows a kind of perfection that reflects an all-knowing creator that is omnipotent, someone who would be able to create a system that works perfectly. And when you look at the human body, when you look at life, microscopic life, life in the wilderness and so on, there is sort of a surface perfection to it that makes it easy to go that direction. But as soon as you begin looking just a half an inch below the surface, you begin to see some falsifiability in the very claim of that perfection.
So we find some things that are imperfect.
Yes.
Okay, but if we're finding some things that are imperfect, wouldn't that also argue against evolution? I mean, if evolution is survival of the fittest, wouldn't we expect things to be perfect and perfectly well designed through evolution?
Right, that's a very good question. And the answer is no, because evolution is not survival of the perfect. It's actually survival of the best available phenotype. So evolution works in two stages. One of the main ways in which it's misrepresented is as a system of total chance. How could all this have come about by total chance? And the answer is it couldn't have. It could not possibly have. Evolution exists in two stages. There is a random stage and there is an utterly non-random stage. The random stage is mutation. The fact that there is genetic mutation, point mutation, there's mutation from radiation and so on. Our genes are likely to manifest various changes that change our adaptability to various conditions. And most mutations are actually neutral. Most mutations don't show up in the phenotype at all in a way that's going to affect survivability. A large number of them are harmful. If you have a mutation to your heart, for example, so the genetic information for your heart, it's possible that it could make your heart less efficient, that it could make it less likely to work well. But there's a small but meaningful number that actually confer an advantage over some other genetic mutations or other genetic examples. Those are the ones that are then going to have an advantage in passing that gene on to their offspring. It doesn't mean that that has arrived at perfection. It just means that relative to the other available phenotypes and genotypes, this one has an advantage. It could be oafish, it could be a Rube Goldberg, situation in the body. But if it's better than that one, then I'm going to compete that one for the limited resources.
So it's survival of the better, not survival
of the better. And as soon as the climate changes, or as soon as the population changes, or any one of a number of other things, it could become less good. So everything is also in a constant state of transition in terms of its position as better or worse.
So what's the best one day? Conditions change. It's not the best another day.
Oh, absolutely. And for that reason, just about everything is in transition. And you should expect to see a mess of slightly adapted systems, very well adapted systems, not terribly well adapted systems. That's what evolution would expect to show, and lo and behold, that's what we have.
I wanted to talk about this random thing. Some people often say that evolution is like a monkey typing at a typewriter and coming up with Hamlet, which is there's not enough time in the universe for that to happen. But what they leave out is the natural selection part, which is the non-random part. And the best example I heard of this was that if as the monkey was typing through, let's say, it was a long piece of paper, and every time he accidentally hit the right key, it stayed. And the mistakes just got wiped out. Well, in 26 times through, he'll randomly get all the letters correct.
Right. That's a good way to phrase that, actually. I've also heard The idea that just, if he hands it to an editor, every time a sheet comes out, the monkey hands it to an editor, the editor gives them a banana, and finds the things that are actual English words, retains those. Same idea. That's what's happening in that second stage. Once the mutations are out there randomly generated, then there is a selection process, a natural selection that happens. It's not some sort of an invisible force. It's just the fact is that if I have something that allows me to compete better for our limited resources than you in the savannah or wherever we are, then I am going to have an edge in reproduction and in survival, and that's going to be conferred to me. That's non-random. That's something that's actually coming from the pressures on us from the outside.
So nature's not starting from scratch with every species.
No.
It's building on the successes of previous species.
It's a cumulative success, right?
Okay. Well, now you were talking about imperfections that we find in life. Do you have any examples of these?
Oh yeah, this is fun. I like to take a look at these, and partially because it's an opportunity to apply Occam's razor. You've got two competing theories that are trying to explain the world as we see it. One of them fails miserably. Intelligent design fails miserably on one after another of these to explain why on earth an intelligent designer would create such a thing. Whereas evolution has a very, very good and plausible explanation for why these things are present. So I've put together a top 10 list.
Top 10 list. We like top 10 lists
yes,
here.
Indeed.
Okay, well, let's start with number 10. What do you have?
Okay, number 10 is actually this is sort of the simplest idea to catch on to. Sort of a class of things, the vestigial organs and structures. Ostrich wings is what we can start with. Ostrich wings have no practical purpose. The ostrich is far too big for them to even be have much to do with balance. So they are simply there. But they require energy. It's a living part of the body, which means that it is taking away part of the energy that comes from food and so on, and that's fairly inefficient. Evolution says that this is a vestigial structure left over from ancestors that were flighted birds that were flying.
They were probably smaller and could fly.
Right. They hadn't adapted the tremendous lower body strength. If you look at an ostrich, it's the most bizarre and incredible thing to look at. It is an imperfect transitional form because it has this vestigial structure there. But it's not harmful enough to be selected against evolutionarily. It's not hurting them to have the wings there. But at the same time, it's doing them no good whatsoever, so it simply stays there as a vestigial structure. That's number 10.
Okay. What do you have for number 9?
Number 9, one of my very favorites would be male nipples, August. Male mammals have nipples because in the embryo, the nipples actually form before sexual divergence happens in the womb. So by the time the divergence of sex happens, after that, you've got the sex organs and so on that come into play. But the nipples form beforehand, simply because that's the way the ontogeny works.
The embryos start out as female, right? And then the nipples form, and then they split.
Yeah, exactly.
If it's going to be male, then it splits after that.
Right. So you can think of it as being the males diverging off the female. But the nipples in males, again, it's a relatively small amount of material, but it's wasted material. Males cannot nurse. They've got the faucet, but not the milk, and that seems a little odd for a perfect designer.
Number 8.
Number 8, to stick with the males for a while, would be the male urethra, which is the exit for the urine. It passes through the prostate gland, which is prone to infection and swelling. And the urethra is actually a soft tube. If it was a hard tube, this wouldn't be a problem. But it's a soft tube, so when the prostate swells, as it does especially in men as they get older, it tends to cut off the flow of this poison out of the body, which is not a terribly good design. It would not have been a particular structural problem to run the urethra around the prostate. Evolution didn't do it, again, because it wasn't presented with that particular option in terms of mutations. So it's got this imperfection in it that an intelligent designer would not have been likely to include.
So that even a human plumber could spot this mistake. And
this is a big embarrassment. This is actually, the plumbing analogy is used quite a bit, that this would be an embarrassing thing for a plumber to do if you had some sort of an insulation system or something around a soft conduit that was then going to swell from heat. It could, it could ruin your system. So.
Okay, number 7.
And number 7 would have to be the human coccyx, which is the tailbone, so-called, because it is actually a vestigial base to the tail. Monkeys have.
At the base of our spine.
Right at the base of the spine, right. It's useless to us except to, enjoy a tremendous increase in pain when you land on it. But for the monkey, it's actually the base of a functional tail that helps in balance and is prehensile and so on. For apes and humans, it is only vestigial. It has no actual structural purpose whatsoever. So why is it there? Why would it be placed there? Evolution makes perfect sense of it. It is vestigial. It has not gone away because it's not harming us in terms of adaptation. But for a perfect designer to put it there, it's really hard to come up with a reason.
Okay, how about 6?
6 is the vertebrate retina, which is a really odd device. The retina is basically a screen at the back of the eyeball on which light is projected. And so we have light sensors, photosensory cells on the back, but they're not facing the light, which would be much more efficient. They're actually facing the back of the retina. Out of the back of the cells are coming their individual nerves. The nerves then, there's a network of nerves that are blocking much of the light from the retina, making it much less efficient. They then come together into the optic nerve, which pokes a hole in the middle of the retina and creates an actual blind spot. We don't see this blind spot because as we're looking ahead, the brain compensates for that by filling in that blind spot with what's around it. But anything that requires a compensatory mechanism is not a perfect system. It's really quite odd. Now, the other interesting thing about that is that the creator found it possible to put perfectly normal retinas in octopus and squid. They've got photoreceptors that are facing the front and an optic nerve that comes out behind them, and so their eyes are much more efficient than ours.
So it can be done right, but in this instance,
for some reason, it was seen as more intelligent to make ours really oddly. So, yeah.
Okay, how about number 5?
Number 5 would be the human jaw and teeth. We have too many teeth for our jaws. It's the reason that the wisdom teeth become impacted, come out in all sorts of strange angles, have to be removed. But it makes sense evolutionarily that as the muzzle was foreshortened and the brain was expanded, we needed more cranial capacity and there was less room for the teeth. But they have not evolved to the point where we actually stop creating the teeth. So instead we've got a compacted jaw with a lot of painful teeth coming out the sides.
And actually, as long as we have dentists that can pull those teeth, there's no disadvantage. It's not going to hurt our reproductive success.
It's not going to hurt us. In one of many ways that technology has actually taken us out of that adaptive loop. Exactly.
Okay, how about number 4?
Number 4 would have to be the appendix. The appendix is a narrow tube that's attached to the large intestine. It's a lot larger in some animals that eat only plant material, and it helps to digest the plants. Ours is strictly vestigial. It's small, and it does nothing in terms of digestion at all. What it's really, really good for is collecting bacteria. It's a perfect shape and position to collect bacteria and to become distended and blocked. 15% of the population will experience this painful and sometimes lethal appendicitis. It is of no use whatsoever except to do us harm, and I don't think that's really part of it.
And I've had mine removed, and I'm perfectly healthy.
You're perfectly fine. It's of no use.
Okay, number 3.
Number 3 is one of the most powerful evolutionary markers. It's the lower back and the pelvis. Even a first-year engineering student would be embarrassed about turning in this structure as the support for our bodies. The lower back has an extreme bend in it that allows you to stand erect. Basically, we have a quadrupedal structural system in the spine and the pelvis. So the back has to bend tremendously in that way, even though the pelvis slants forward for knuckle dragging. It's actually slanted in a position that makes it extremely easy to go forward. That's the position that gorillas and chimps and so on have, but we have evolved bipedally, and our system has not caught up yet with our bipedal structure, so we're in a constant threat of injury and also of falling over and being in disaster that way.
So again, nature had to make do with what it had.
Exactly right, yeah.
Whereas if it had been designed from scratch, you would have expected a better job.
Right.
Okay. Number 2.
Number 2 is the maxillary sinuses. Our sinuses right here drain upward, which makes no sense whatsoever, and that's the reason people get sinus infections. That's the reason that you get sinus headaches. It makes a tremendous amount of sense for all the sinuses to drain with gravity, which is exactly what they did in a quadruped. When we were quadrupeds and the sinuses would drain down and forward,
Okay.
that would be a sensible design. Now we are bipedal, and the sinuses haven't caught up, so we have this really quite strange plumbing in our faces.
Okay. Well, the number one example of unintelligent design.
The number one I would have to point to is one of my favorites, the discovery of pelvises in whales. Pelvises and hind limbs in whales. There are actually these vestigial bones, just fragmentary, small, but definite pelvis morphology that is in the body of a whale and serves not the remotest purpose whatsoever. What it does do is point to an ancestral land-dwelling animal that actually walked. And this is one of the strangest things you can imagine putting in a whale is the mechanism for walking, if it did not at one time come from a walking ancestor.
Yeah, well, that reminds me of the, it's pretty well known in science, the Basilosaurus that had those small hind legs, useless for walking, but obviously, as you say, a vestigial trait from when it was a land mammal.
Right, that's the intermediary.
And they recently found a skeleton called a Durodon, and the hip bone is not even connected to the spine, so it's totally useless if it's not getting any, it's just kind of sitting there.
Right.
So, okay. So when creationists argue for an intelligent designer, and the biological evidence is that there are many examples of poor design, that refutes intelligent design immediately.
I think it would have to. You're starting with a premise that turns out to be false. The premise is that we are somehow perfect, that we are designed by someone with immense design capabilities and infinite intelligence, and it turns out that we were designed by a much more sloppy and natural process than that.
So really, if the intelligent designers were being honest, they would immediately have to change the name of their theory to sloppy design or evil design. Okay, now then there wouldn't be a conflict.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I'll write them a letter and see if they'll consider that.
Okay. It reminds me of there's a theist and evolutionist named Kenneth Miller, and he has one of my favorite quotes. He said, "If God purposely designed 30 horse species that later disappeared, then God's primary attribute is incompetence. He can't make it right the first time."
Right.
So
that's a good one.
Okay. Any final comments in the minute we have left?
I think I've said everything my appendix can bear. So.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us for Atheist Talk. If you'd like a free sample newsletter, just contact us. We'd be happy to send you one. And we hope that you'll consider becoming a member of Minnesota Atheists. If you're interested in us, we're interested in you.